We would like to thank the Australasian Animal Studies Association for their sponsorship of our 2 student prizes. These merit-based prizes will be awarded to a pre-PhD presenter and a PhD presenter whose presentations best fit with our ethos of respect, dignity, and benefit for other than human animals.
So our next talk today is with Madelena Quick, who is a PhD candidate at the Victoria University of Wellington, where she also teaches on courses including design, ethnography, and speculative design. So Madelena is interested in spaces which are crafted for animals, as well as the wider animal sanctuary movement. So her talk today is going to explore the more than human worlds of farms and farm animal sanctuaries. And so I can already tell we're going to have another very interesting intersection between disciplines as we look at spaces as well as the more than human animals' lives.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. As said, my name is Madelena Quick, and I am a PhD candidate at the Victoria University of Wellington School of Design Innovation in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And today I'll be talking about the more than human worlds of farms and farm animal sanctuaries. So first of all, I'll be positioning myself as a researcher and talking briefly about my research interest, and then I'll take you through the value of thinking with worlds and how that informed my creation of an interpretive framework to analyze the stories we tell about farmed animals. And then I will show you how I used that framework to analyze farmed animal memoirs. And then finally, I'll take you through the phase I'm currently working on, which is my speculative design work that acts as a response to my analysis of farm memoirs. So first of all, my research interest is in understanding the spaces we share with farmed animals, and this really began during my master's research, where I spent time on a pig farm and explored the ways one farmer told stories about his pigs through social media, and then I kind of developed new narratives about pigs. Since that project, my research has expanded to include animal rights activism and advocacy. So now my focus is also on farm animal sanctuaries, which are spaces where formerly farmed animals are housed and taken under the sanctuary's care. So my background research, especially as a design researcher, really centers on the value of thinking with worlds, because that invites us to think not just with entities, but with relations. This includes relations within worlds, but also relations across worlds and the plurality of worlds that humans and other than human beings inhabit. It also brings up all kinds of questions about whose world counts or who counts in the world. Where do different worlds rub up against each other, and what kinds of frictions arise between these different worlds? Specifically, I'm interested in the frictions between farm worlds and sanctuary worlds. So the next part of my research, I focused on some of the primary concerns that arise in public responses towards farms and sanctuaries and the academic literature around that. So the three kind of main concerns around farming are concern for farmed animal welfare, concern for the environmental degradation as an impact of farming, and then the impacts on human health. And for sanctuaries, some of the concerns arise because of the notion that the animals are only as free as possible. So they sit within a kind of captive freedom where they're still kept within fences, medical regimes, and human routines. The utopian ideals of sanctuaries in aiming for a kind of ideal world and their intent versus their impact being quite significant, because sanctuaries still represent a kind of fringe example of one of the ways we live with farmed animals. And then the criticism around the whiteness of the vegan movement and questions around who is left out of the process and marginalized in building a world free from the oppression of farmed animals. Another key component of my research is staying with the trouble. So I've made a commitment to staying with the trouble and aligning with neither side of polarized debates around farm worlds and sanctuary worlds. So I sit within the gray in these discussions rather than the black or the white. And this means that in my research, I'm sort of navigating the messiness inherent within that rather than siding with a purity of belief. Donna Haraway wrote about staying with the trouble in 2016. And what she said was that staying with the trouble does not require a relationship to times called the present. In fact, staying with the trouble requires learning to be truly present, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or salvific futures, but as mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, and meanings. So out of all of this background research, I created an interpretive framework to analyze the narratives told about farm worlds and sanctuary worlds in terms of how much they center more than human worlds in order to address some of those concerns I spoke about previously. And I also used this framework to pinpoint the similarities and differences between farm worlds and sanctuary worlds, and used it to also ultimately explore new ways of living well with other animals. So this is my framework that I've used across my entire research project. So I looked at the narrative elements of these stories, which were the characters, the settings, the relationships, and the morals and values of the stories. And then I analyzed them through the lenses of landscape, kinship, and care. I positioned landscape like that as an attempt to undo human representations of landscape as social product. So I look at the ways land features as a foregrounded character in the story rather than as backdrop, and whether or not harms and reparations are reckoned with. I also looked at how kinship was represented and whether non-human animals were presented as kinfolk through stories of closeness to them, whether there was space for restorative and reciprocal kinship in the stories, and whether they ultimately challenged power hierarchies. And then I also looked at care in the stories, so whether or not the characters, human and other than human, were presented as worthy in receiving of care, how there were stories of different ways of caring for non-human animals within a cycle of life and death, and then ultimately that these stories of careful multi-species assemblages promise restorative justice. So now just to show you how that analysis, that framework was actually applied, I'll show you how I used it to analyze farmed animal memoirs. So I initially read farm sanctuary memoirs due to a gap in academic literature about the sanctuary movement and the embodied values and practices of actually running a sanctuary. So I read 8 memoirs written by farm animal sanctuary owners. And then I also read 10 memoirs written by farmers. So I'll take you through some of the themes that emerged when analyzing the memoirs through my framework. So farmers and sanctuary owners wrote about a kind of rural idyll as the setting for their stories, and they constructed the landscape in terms of its simplicity, innocence, and virtuosity as part of a pastoral myth of a lost Eden divorced from the harsh realities of rural life and masking exploitation and oppression. They presented a bucolic landscape as the setting for the worlds that was aesthetically beautiful and removed from other types of worlds. They wrote about environmental degradation, especially in farm memoirs, where the effects of climate change were impacting the balance of the seasons and therefore impacting production. They also presented their responsibility as farmers in terms of environmental reparations and their awareness of the impact of livestock agriculture. The sanctuary owners presented the environment quite differently in terms of their overall message was the urging for readers to go vegan as one way of mitigating environmental damage. Kinship was told through either mass animality or individual animality. So farmers relate to their animals in groups of species, and their relationships with them were framed in terms of welfare. Sanctuary owners focused much more on the individuality of the animals. Each animal in the story was named, and they were often associated with a short anecdote about the sanctuary resident. The kinship with non-human animals was much stronger than kind of writing about the setting as part of this assemblage of kin. Family, friendship, and love was another way these memoirists told stories about the non-human animals. So sanctuary owners presented their worlds as a site for an interspecies family with opportunities for love and friendship between members of this community. Again, farmers related to most of their animals through welfare rather than friendship, but there were some exceptions, especially with working dogs on the farm and the sick animals who they brought in to their homes. Power hierarchies and human-animal relations were both challenged and affirmed in stories about current socio-political conditions for farmed animals, so still very wrapped up in a lot of those concerns I talked about at the beginning. Finally, care was presented through the hard daily labor necessary to run a farm or a sanctuary. So both farmers and sanctuary owners expressed concerns around finances, illnesses, medical treatment, physical labor, and public opinion, and also living and working within a rural landscape separate from a kind of urban way of life presented unique issues that they wrote about from a first-person perspective, such as navigating weather and isolation. Finally, both farmers and sanctuary owners wrote about the death of farmed animals and the political and ethical implications for them. Both of them wrote about what kinds of death were preferable, with sanctuary owners practicing euthanasia on their sanctuaries. And there was one sanctuary owner who elected to forego euthanasia altogether and let the animal sort of life run its course. Overall, there were limitations in how close these stories could get to restorative justice for more than human worlds. But what they did do for my design research was open up space to explore how to live and die well with other animals within careful multi-species assemblages. So the way I explored this space was through my speculative design practice. So I'm going to take you through some of the thinking and the iterations that I've been working through. Speculative design is a creative design practice and methodology that is used to ask what-if questions about how things could be different. So it's not tied to reality too much. You can create kind of implausible and radical futures and design what they might look like. It's also used to explore and communicate different ways of telling stories, in my case, about our relations with farmed animals. It thrives on imagination and aims to open up new perspectives on what are sometimes called wicked problems, to create spaces for discussion and debate about alternative ways of being, and to inspire and encourage people's imaginations to flow freely. So first of all, one of the first creative exercises I did was to write a bunch of prompts that I then wrote stories as responses to. And the whole idea of this was to create a kind of multi-worlding narrative where I was adopting the perspectives of different worlds. So I tried to write from the perspectives of animals within sanctuaries and farms. I tried to write from the perspectives of farmers, of sanctuary owners, and writing about different kind of futures and pasts in terms of the ways we live with farmed animals. So this is really the beginning of the creative design journey. I then designed an imaginary sanctuary journal where I adopted the perspective of a sanctuary owner and wrote about what it would be like to experience the collapse of livestock agriculture in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and all of the grief that would follow. One of the reasons I didn't finish this was because it not only didn't meet my framework fully in that I wasn't prioritizing more than human worlds enough. I was still writing from a singular kind of first-person perspective. But also my task was to imagine what would happen afterwards, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't imagine a kind of ideal world, and I know that's sort of the end goal of sanctuary work, but it just didn't kind of align with my ethics as a researcher and the research I had done previously. So what I'm currently working on and the kind of design that I've landed with is an imaginary co-design workshop. And I'm imagining that it is a workshop that spans lifetimes. So oftentimes co-design is done with a team of people. You get people together to kind of collaborate and design something. But in this case, I'm kind of bending the rules of co-design and making it something that lasts lifetimes. And it gathers human and non-human animals together on the land and asks them to collaboratively create their world. So it's an imaginary platform where participants are provided with a handbook containing the rules and guidelines, prompt cards for the participants, and they're given kind of 400 acres of land with assorted shelters on them. Again, this is a thought experiment, so I'm not actually going to do this. There are 3 groups of participants: human participants, animal participants, and land participants. And the whole idea is that each group have their own prompt cards. They get to decide what they want to do in the world. And this is my kind of attempt at equalizing the participants so that it's less anthropocentric. So just to briefly take you through some of the cards, I'm still in the process of visualizing and refining these cards, but just to give you a sense of what the human, animals, and land would be prompted to do. The humans are in red, animals in yellow, and land in green. In this one, they're asked to acquaint themselves with their surroundings, and then they're supposed to ask questions around how they're going to relate to each other on this land. What will they ask of each other? How will they seek to kind of repair any damage done or any harms created towards the other participants? For this prompt card, it's actually asking the humans, first of all, whether they want to build fences or not. So kind of creating that notion, this is neither a farm nor a sanctuary, you're creating something new. And then if they do erect the fences, the animals are prompted to break them, and the land is prompted to tempt the animals to do that. A third example is this one, which is a lot more sort of gentle than the last one. This one is really centered on the human, animal, and land participants grounding themselves. So relying on each other, choosing a companion to sit with, to breathe with, to settle in with. And the whole idea is that I'm trying to create an imaginary platform that creates a careful multi-species assemblage and a world where there is something different from farming and from sanctuary. I'd just like to finish with a quote by Ursula K. Le Guin, whose writing has informed every phase of my research, especially this final phase. And she said that to make a new world, you start with an old one, certainly. To find a world, maybe you have to have lost one. Maybe you have to be lost. The dance of renewal, the dance that made the world, was always danced here at the edge of things, on the brink, on the foggy coast. Thank you.
Madelena, thank you so much. That was another very, very rich presentation. And in true APE fashion, we already have lots of questions coming in for you in the Padlet. So do take a look. We will come back to your questions after the last presenter. But yeah, thank you. I'm slightly speechless. You've managed to cover so much in such depth with creativity and innovation. It is really impressive work. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is a master's degree student at Canisius College here in the US. Alisa works in the animal sheltering field and prioritizes keeping other than human animals in their current homes and communities. I do want to give you another content warning for this presentation. I will be discussing weight-based discrimination and the consequences of weight-based discrimination, such as eating disorders, anxiety, depression, and stress. So with that, I will turn it over to Alisa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be closing out such a fantastic series of talks. My name is Alisa Rubinstein, and I'm a master's student in Anthrozoology at Canisius University now. I learned this the other day that we're at university. And so, yeah, today I'll be talking a little bit about how a One Health framework can be used to dismantle some of the misconceptions about the obesity epidemic in human and veterinary medicine. There we go. So before beginning, just want to rehash a quick content warning. Because of the nature of this topic, fat phobia and weight-based discrimination are going to come up, which I know is a topic that can stir up all kinds of emotions, and I very much appreciate everyone's engagement with this content. But please do take care and feel free to step away at any point. I also want to make a quick note regarding the language that we'll be using. The terms overweight and obese are categories most commonly used in the dominant Western medical system to describe fat healthcare seekers. And because this is the system that we'll be talking about, these terms are going to come up, but I do want to make it clear that they are far from the most ideal way to describe people's bodies. Many fat liberation activists encourage the use of the word fat as a neutral descriptor, like thin or tall, so that's generally the word that I'll be defaulting to. Additionally, I do want to acknowledge that we often use the terms doctors and veterinarians as shorthand for the influence of the dominant medical system. Caregiving professions have extremely high rates of burnout, so I want to be clear that this shorthand is meant to recognize that individual medical professionals often hold power and privilege over their patients, and like all other people, they hold biases, and even well-meaning intent can have a very real and dangerous impact on healthcare seekers. So with that all being said, unpacking our assumptions about weight and health just in humans can be its own talk. So I first want to take a few minutes to share some key information and make sure that we're all on the same page. Although we're often taught to attribute one's weight to their individual lifestyle choices, research shows us that weight is actually determined by a complex set of factors, many outside of one's control. These include genetics, epigenetics, nutrition, environmental factors, body shape and build, etc. In fact, most attempts to lose weight are unsuccessful, as one's body will often compensate to maintain its current weight. Furthermore, the links between weight and overall health are tenuous at best, and research has found that additional fat can be protective in some cases. So fat isn't always unhealthy, and thin isn't always healthy. Because humans come in a variety of shapes and sizes, cardiovascular measures like heart disease and blood pressure are much more directly related to overall health, and the two might not change with weight the way we would expect. So for example, someone who starts exercising could maintain or gain weight while improving their cardiovascular measures and overall health status. So all this to say, this issue is very complicated, and there's still a lot we need to learn before conclusively making claims about the relationships between weight and health. So this then begs the question, if we have limited control over our weight at best, and if the amount of fat on our bodies might not even cause major health risks, where is the fixation on weight coming from in the medical system? Well, science and healthcare don't exist in a vacuum, and there are lots of ways in which culture and politics have affected how fat healthcare seekers are treated within and outside of the doctor's office. A huge piece of this is acknowledging that there's a track record of major pharmaceutical companies and weight loss companies, as well as researchers who run weight loss clinics, funding research and policy on a national and international scale to broaden the definition of obesity, as well as fuel fat-phobic rhetoric about the so-called obesity epidemic, which stigmatizes fat bodies and frames them as unhealthy and undesirable. Naturally, the more people believe this, the more they will purchase these products and services with the goal of becoming thinner. Doctors are people too, of course, and the dominant narrative affects how doctors perceive fat bodies, and many hold negative views about fat clients. They report believing that fat clients are overindulgent, lazy, and non-compliant, and some even report that they would rather not treat fat clients at all. It's important to note that this data is based on self-reported views and doesn't account for professionals who might not be aware of their implicit biases. And so we see two major results stemming from these beliefs. One is that doctors spend less time with fat clients and order fewer preventative tests. And another is that fat clients report feeling stigmatized by their doctors, as well as delaying doctor's visits when something is wrong out of fear of being shamed about their bodies or having their concerns blamed on their weight. This is especially true for women, people of color, and trans folks who often already risk receiving substandard care. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that intertwined with all of this is the fact that navigating the world as a member of any marginalized group can itself lead to compromised health by way of minority stress. So this includes existing in a constant state of fight or flight, anxiety and depression, and fat folks in general are prone to eating disorders. And so it turns out that how fat folks are treated by the dominant medical system and by society rather than their weight is a major determinant of their health outcomes. And while we've made some progress in recognizing this in human medicine, we definitely still have a lot of work to do. So now that we've kind of laid that groundwork, we're going to bring it back to how this is related to non-human animals. Recently, public health officials have been encouraged to adopt a One Health framework, which highlights the interface between human, non-human, animal, and environmental health. We very commonly see this approach applied to emerging zoonotic diseases, but we also see it applied to topics like the psychological benefits of the human-animal bond and comparative or translational medicine, which is mainly where we'll be focusing on. It turns out that what we've done a really good job of is taking the fatphobic narrative that exists in human healthcare and extending it to our companion animals. The same troubling assumptions and crisis discourse are used to describe the pet obesity epidemic. And this is just a snapshot of articles that I pulled from Google that frame fatness as something to fear, using words like danger and stating that the epidemic is striking pets. The Journal of Comparative Pathology even published several articles in 2017 that encouraged the use of the One Health framework in this way to prevent obesity. And a lot of the language found in these articles contributes to harmful stereotypes about fat people and animals. A recent study by Pearl et al. Was the first to examine anti-fat bias in veterinary medicine. Veterinarians were shown different combinations of the dog caregiver dyad. So you had a fat dog, fat caregiver, thin caregiver, fat dog, thin caregiver, and thin dog, fat caregiver. And then they were given a survey to assess their attitudes towards and perceptions of these combinations. The results of this study are unfortunately what you might expect based on what we've already discussed. Many of the participants connected the weight of the caregiver and ostensibly made assumptions about their health habits and status with that of the dogs. So they gave credit to thin caregivers for keeping their dogs lean, and they blamed fat caregivers for their dogs being quote unquote obese. Participants were also less likely to attribute fat dogs' weight to biological factors if the caregiver also happened to be fat. Participants also rated the caregivers of fat dogs as unlikely to comply with weight loss regimes for their animals, which directly parallels how human doctors assume fat humans are non-compliant. And perhaps most alarmingly, 10% of participants self-reported recommending that their human clients seek weight management treatment from their physician. The authors themselves were very surprised by these findings, since veterinarians aren't authorized to give human medical advice. And even though the intent of these veterinarians is likely well-meaning, the ultimate impact is a breach of dignity, boundaries, and trust between the care provider and the client. So while this study is preliminary, it certainly informs us that the veterinary community isn't immune to the same biases as human medical professionals and all other people. And so as we keep digging further, it continues to be abundantly clear that the same stigmatization and medicalization of human bodies is being applied to veterinary patients. You might be thinking that the slide looks familiar, and that's because this is the same list of responses to common misconceptions about weight and health in humans that we started with. The One Health framework in this particular case has extended these misconceptions to how we think about non-human animals. Since humans are the most heavily researched animal when it comes to determinants of weight, and the research shows us that it's complicated, it's reasonable to infer that this would be the case, at least for other mammals that are relatively closely related to us, like cats and dogs. We've also found that in other animals, just like in humans, maintaining weight loss is very difficult, and some of the literature on non-human animals acknowledges this, but I do think it's very telling that we don't follow that data to its natural conclusion. Is weight loss the most effective recommendation if it's not only usually unsuccessful, but also perpetuates the harmful narrative of the non-compliant patient when it inevitably doesn't work? And of course, with so much literature in humans showing that weight and health aren't as closely linked as we thought, this is another area where it seems ill-advised to jump to conclusions in companion animals. And to add one final point, an additional parallel we see is that pharmaceutical companies and major food conglomerates like Nestle and Mars have financial stakes in producing and marketing prescription and specialty weight loss foods for companion animals. So there are very powerful players that are economically incentivized to promote thinness as desirable and to conflate it with the health of our cats and dogs. So now that I've spent the last 10 minutes highlighting how One Health has played a role in perpetuating a harmful narrative, where do we go from here? How do we dismantle a narrative that's so deeply ingrained in our medical system, as well as society at large? And can we use the ideas of One Health to improve medical care for healthcare seekers of all sizes and species? We can start by looking to Health at Every Size, which is a framework that's emerged to counteract weight bias in medicine. It summarizes a lot of what we've already discussed, and the goal is to create a more compassionate and holistic approach to human healthcare by acknowledging that people can be healthy on a diverse spectrum of shapes and sizes, that dieting isn't only ineffective, but can have dangerous implications to physical and mental health, that a positive and intuitive relationship with food and exercise can be promoted without a focus on weight loss, and that, perhaps most importantly, regardless of one's health status, their weight should never be a barrier to respectful care, diagnostic testing, and treatment. An excellent application of the One Health framework would be to take some of these principles and develop an equivalent approach that can be used in the veterinary setting to dismantle some of these harmful beliefs and improve the services that fat companion animals and their caregivers receive. The Pearl et al. Study is a great starting point that shows us how the attitudes of veterinarians might parallel those of human doctors. And another potential application of One Health would be to further investigate health outcomes for fat companion animals and how these might be driven by veterinarians' biases. Areas for exploration could include what diagnostics, treatment plans, and overall medical outcomes look like for fat versus thin patients, especially when it comes to concerns that might be attributed to or dismissed due to an animal's weight, how much time veterinarians are spending with fat animals versus thin animals, and whether or not fat human clients or those with fat animals feel stigmatized or shamed when interacting with their vet. And could they be delaying treatment or switching vets often because of this? A complicating factor of the Pearl et al. Study is that they demonstrate that both the humans and the animal's weight seem to affect how veterinarians perceive the caregiver-animal dyad. So this does have to be considered when we're trying to figure out the answers to these questions. And finally, some scholars have reframed this dual obesity epidemic as a dual moral panic. Although this isn't an extension of One Health per se, it's a note I want to end on, as it's a helpful framing tool to determine where an extension of One Health is useful versus where we might be extending findings that are produced and popularized by social bias and corporate interests. Moral panic is defined as an artificially created panic or scare in which moral entrepreneurs have demonized dangerous groups to serve their own interests. Moral panics have, with isolated exceptions, been initiated by powerful interest groups to manage the bodies and behavior of threatening groups, often the poor and powerless. So despite everything we've talked about, the complexity of the health research and the very real, indisputable, and tangible effects that fatphobia has on fat people, fat bodies, both human and non-human, are demonized and framed as threats to the moral fabric of society. This is ultimately a form of epistemic violence that takes our attention away from more salient determinants of health that we actually have power over, like housing, access to equitable and affordable healthcare, job security, access to clean water, and food sovereignty. And so to conclude, the way in which the current One Health approach pathologizes fat bodies of all species is ultimately harmful to healthcare seekers. A reorientation of the One Health framework would be one that works to dismantle biases, critically examines the literature to identify biased work, acknowledges the complex, dynamic, and systemic determinants of health, and extends a holistic and compassionate approach to health across the species barrier. Evaluating how exactly One Health is applied to comparative medicine is crucial if we're going to move into a direction of more equitable, just, and dignified healthcare for humans and non-humans of all shapes and sizes. And then I have my references. And thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great presentation.
We're moving on to Lux Profus, I hope I've said that correctly, who has a master's degree in criminology from the University of Warsaw in Poland. And Lux will be talking about the roles and fate of animals in the war in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you very much, Lux.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Lux, and let's start already because we don't have so much time. It is important to remember that whether there is war or peace, non-human animals always have lower rights and protections than humans, which is often overlooked, and they are also affected more and unnoticed by war discourse. That is why I would like to briefly discuss some of the problems that affects animal at war. The situation of animals at war is difficult in that they are completely unable to understand human conflicts, yet they are fully involved in them, just as they are victims to human mechanism in peacetime. For animals, there is no concept of state, borders, or war, yet they are also become victims of it and suffer real losses. It happens that people nevertheless take their pets with them and try to cross the borders with them. This happened to many Ukrainian citizens who took their dogs and cats with them when fleeing the Russian invasion. Unfortunately, if animals do get rescued during the war, they are usually only dogs and cats, treated by people as family members. When it comes to animals living on farms, they are not so fortunate, and this is due to two things: less sympathy to them by people, and the fact they are too big or there are too many of them to carry them across the border. This division shows the reality that applies to animals in peacetime as well. They are not treated equally by humans. Some are given the status of friends or family members, and others serve the function of an object or property, and that's the reason for different approaches to their evacuation. The article Silence Victims of War by Hanna Mazurek recalls a narrative that often appears in war, namely language, which speaks of the animalization of people in war as a term for primitive and cruel behavior, the opposite of which is supposed to be humanism in the broadest sense. Meanwhile, animals in war persist in a role even worse than the most civilians, because their nightmare continues all at times. It doesn't matter if there is war or peace, and when war does come, their rescue comes at the very end, if at all. We can see examples of this, the fate of animals living at the zoos, farms, and even forests who are involved in war. An example is the chicken farm in Chernobyevka, which even before the war was a place of great injustice, where the animals were exploited and killed every day, and when the supply of feed to hens was cut off due to the war, the animals starved to death. And the article War is Also Hell for Animals by Katarzyna Przyborska says that although the procedures for transporting chickens, pigs, or cows from a country of war make it possible to help them, it is much harder due to epidemiological diseases, and although few animals manage to cross borders in this way, millions of animals remain, and these animals are not granted any refugee status. The fate of animals in zoos is very similar. Often they are abandoned because the area has been covered by war and the animals themselves are too large to evacuate. Locked in the cages, they can only wait to die of starvation unless they die beforehand from shell damage or became food for soldiers. During Russia's current invasion of Ukraine, Russian soldiers, deprived of provisions, ate some of the animals from Ukrainian zoo. And one of the more shocking examples was a kangaroo, which is often cited to show their dehumanization, since eating a certain type of animal is considered abnormal, while other can be eaten on a regular basis. And of course, the situation of trapped animals is tragic, but it's not particularly different from the situation of those that are killed every day in a peacetime. So the conclusion is, I believe that war illustrates animal abuse, but it starts much earlier in a peacetime. For many kinds of animals, war is eternal. It's their everyday life. So we need to completely change our treatment of animals in a peacetime if we want to help them in a wartime. So that's all. Thank you very much. I know it was pretty short, but I am actually afraid to speak in English, and it was my first, not Polish, conference. So thank you very much. That's all.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant, and your English was fantastic. If that was your first your first English conference, it was absolutely great. And the subject matter is something that's very dear to my heart, and definitely I would like to talk to you again in the future about that.